The agenda for tonight is I'm going to do a more formal lecture type of presentation. As was written on the meetup, this is going to be very technically advanced. It's going to be confusing if you're new to Bitcoin. Even if you're a Bitcoin user, a lot of those concepts you might not spend a lot of time thinking about. We're going to try to go as easy as we can, as professor-like as we can. This is a university after all. So it's going to be really an education session where my goal is to give you some kind of conceptual tools, some knowledge, some insights, and some of my personal opinions. And that's going to be very clear when it's my personal opinion or not. Regarding the upcoming Bitcoin fork on August 1st, and regarding potential other upcoming Bitcoin forks, and just the scaling debate in general. So just as a way to gauge the audience, who in the audience knows what this means, UASF? So is aware, and please do raise your hand if you do know. Okay, so that's really, really good, really good. So for people who are on the video, we're streaming this live, by the way. So for those of you, that's about 2/3 of the room. Who here knows what this is? But don't shout it if you know what this is. Assert 0. What it is? You know what it is. Okay. So this is a good gauge of the audience. Perfect. So I'll tell what it is later. Okay, so let's start with a little disclaimer first. So nobody understands Bitcoin, and that's okay. So this is a really good quote that I like from a guy called Jameson Locke. He's a Bitcoin engineer, and he's a very well-known person in the space, a thought leader in this debate. The point is that what I'm about to tell you is self-taught knowledge. I don't have an expert background in cryptocurrency or distributed systems, so all of this is stuff that I learned over the last 3 years of research. We have Quentin here, which is a little bit more knowledgeable than me, which is going to chip in for the more technical parts, and which is supposed to stop me if I say something that's wrong. So that's his main job for tonight. Why is Bitcoin so hard to understand? And specifically, we're going to be talking about Bitcoin protocol upgrade procedures and the Bitcoin scaling debate. So it's pretty, at the point where you're starting to talk about how the consensus works in Bitcoin and understanding that, you're already pretty deep in there. So it's hard because it's this nexus of a lot of different fields, which require knowledge from different fields, and also a certain frame of mind. So economic theory, monetary science, cryptography, game theory is usually the place where some people get lost. It's really not hard to grasp. Computer networking. It's a paradigm shift. The governance model of Bitcoin cannot be compared to anything that exists. Nakamoto consensus is not a democracy. It's not an autocracy. It's really hard because we don't have any kind of mental references. So at some point, people do get this aha moment, and people get it. I got it twice. I got the aha moment when I thought I understood Bitcoin, and I got the aha moment where I understood really the consensus part. So what we're talking about today. And this really made me as, okay, so I understand now like how the blockchain works. But still, as we can see, you have this curve when you get into Bitcoin. So you start out thinking that you know nothing because you know nothing. And then, you're an expert. And then at some point you go so deep because the rabbit hole never ends. It's impossible to claim to have full, there's 100 people maybe in the world that can really claim to be true, full Bitcoin experts. So that's my long disclaimer. Let's start. So this presentation is about governance challenges. So governance challenges in upgrading the blockchain, but there's another challenge that Bitcoin attempts to solve as decentralized consensus. So when we talk about what's the point of Bitcoin, what are we trying to achieve with the system, it's to get anonymous competing untrusted parties to agree in an open and hostile environment. So obviously that's not an easy task to challenge. So before we do that, we're going to be talking a lot tonight about nodes, mining nodes, full nodes, economic nodes, also some nodes, also some networks. So let's just go over a quick recap of what these are. So Bitcoin is structured as a peer-to-peer network architecture on top of the internet. There's no server, there's no centralized service, there's no hierarchy within the network. Nodes both provide and consume resources at the same time. This is true for most peer-to-peer networks. If you've ever run a BitTorrent client to download a movie legally, of course, you saw that you had seeders and leechers. So seeders, they provide resources to the network, which is pieces of data, and leechers, they're leechers. The Bitcoin network, when we're talking about the Bitcoin network, we're talking about this collection of nodes that you see there. So here, when we're talking about nodes, there's different types of formats of nodes, of different functions, but they're all equal. So a node is a computer program that you download on your computer, download on a server that you're running, which is fully validating transactions in a block. Almost all full nodes help the network by accepting transactions and blocks from other full nodes, so reeling them. And most importantly, as we'll see later, the full nodes, they validate those transactions and blocks, and they also validate them against the rules of Bitcoin. So suggested reading for this is Mastering Bitcoin, Andreas Antonopoulos' book, chapter 6, the Bitcoin network. So moving on. Specific type of node, economic nodes. So what are economic nodes? We hear a lot about this term, and it doesn't mean much. So I'll just call it, economic nodes are participants in the Bitcoin economy. So these are participants. They can be individuals, like very large wealthy holders or traders and stuff like that. Usually we're talking about companies. I see there's platforms that allow Bitcoin users to engage in price discovery, such as exchanges, trading platforms. They allow fiat to enter and leave a blockchain. So they are the on-ramp, off-ramp, such as Bills, such as Coinbase, such as Glidera, all this stuff. The economic nodes, they provide the usefulness and value to a blockchain. So they can decrease, these nodes can decrease or increase demand for cryptocurrency as a direct result of their actions and policies. And those nodes are drivers of network effect. So these are institutions around which users will revolve. For instance, in the case of a big node, Coinbase, a lot of the users are kind of stuck in this ecosystem. They're revolving around that, and Coinbase drives the network effect of Bitcoin with that by using Bitcoin. So these economic nodes can also be delegated some responsibilities by Bitcoin users, as we'll see a bit later. And the distinction is that some nodes are more equal than others in Bitcoin, although in the protocol level, they're all the same nodes. So if I'm holding one Bitcoin or if I'm running Coinbase, there's no difference between our two nodes from an architecture point of view. But one of them is clearly more important than the other because that node is routing traffic, is broadcasting traffic, and is accepting traffic from billions and billions of dollars. So it's much more important in the economics of Bitcoin than a regular node. Which doesn't mean they have any special privilege whatsoever, of course. Excuse me. Okay. Okay, so delegated supernodes. This is oh, right. So a list of economic nodes. I'll just go through a list. Holders are really big economic nodes. So people that hold Bitcoin on a node and decide not to dump and decide not to sell, they give value to that blockchain. So holders are super important economic nodes. Exchanges, payment processors, and OTCs like Bitcoin ATMs and the off-ramp, on-ramp. For most of the users which don't know which chain they're transacting on, Bitcoin ATM operator is probably one of the most important players in this debate right now, because ultimately when someone goes to put cash in there, he's going to decide, which coins he's sending to that person and claiming to be Bitcoin. And the most important function of economic nodes, as far as I'm concerned, is determining which chain is Bitcoin, right? So if you're Kraken or Coinbase, your power is to say, well, this is Bitcoin and this is Bitcoin 2x, this is Bitcoin USF, this is legacy coin or not. So the brand name Bitcoin, ultimately the businesses that are selling Bitcoin and buying Bitcoin will be saying, well, I consider this to be Bitcoin or not. And there will be I guess a market consensus that will spontaneously emerge around one definition or not, but it's very possible that two different jurisdictions, for example, we might see somewhere in Asia, somewhere in the West, where people have just different definitions of which chain is Bitcoin according to what the exchanges decide to do. So this is a term that doesn't exist in textbooks. I'm still trying to figure out how to frame it But you can, some nodes are not economic nodes per se, but they're more important because a lot of users delegate crucial tasks to them. You can think of Mycelium wallet. That's not necessarily an economic node, it's just a wallet, but you are connecting to Mycelium's node, and you're delegating a lot of tasks to Mycelium, for example, the validation of the blocks and so forth. Blockchain.info, block explorers, these don't necessarily increase the fiat on-ramp, off-ramp of Bitcoin, but they are nonetheless more equal than others because, for example, if blockchain.info, the world's most used block explorer, decides to say that one chain is another, or decides to feed some information to the users, well, they have a big weight, although they're not necessarily an exchange. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Okay, so what's the objective of this whole thing? What's the goal we're trying to achieve? It's to enforce the consensus rule. So the governance model of Bitcoin, lesson number 1, is Nakamoto consensus. So it's a process by which anonymous participants in a decentralized peer-to-peer system spontaneously agree on a history of continuous additions to a transactions ledger. This is kind of a definition that I made up using a few definitions. So it's a very interesting governance model because the goal is to agree on something, and we're interested parties, and there's this whole system by which we coordinate our actions in order to agree spontaneously on this thing without any coercion involved. So that's why it's relatively unique. And what's unique about Nakamoto consensus is that it works, right? Bitcoin has been running for 8 years now, and we have seen it in action, and we know that this is something that actually works. So what Bitcoin does, the system does essentially, is we're channeling market forces and we're fostering competition with incentive structures built in directly in the cryptographic protocols. And we always assume that everyone will act out of self-interest. So the genius of Satoshi, one of the geniuses of Satoshi, was to make sure that the incentive structure was such that if people always act in their self-interest, they're always kind of entering this spontaneous order and cooperating. So it's a system of checks and balances, which ensures decentralization and open participation. So in the Bitcoin governance process, there's multiple stakeholders that all have a lot of skin in the game. So how it works is that miners use their vote to timestamp transactions into blocks to prevent double spending, which is the goal of Bitcoin. They exercise this vote by providing a proof of work. So they prove that they did some work, which was derived from a very computationally expensive repetition of hashing functions, essentially. So the miners, they basically do math and they prove they did math, and this is what makes Bitcoin work. The integrity of the ledger is ultimately preserved by the ability of all the participants to independently validate whether each vote followed the rules. So this is the recipe. So like how the blockchain is made, essentially. So the blockchain, and this is just a kind of a language issue, but I don't necessarily agree with the idea that the blockchain is the technology behind Bitcoin. That specific quote is really weird to me, because the blockchain is the result of the output of the nodes spontaneously agreeing together using Nakamoto consensus on which transactions and blocks are valid. And this is what makes Bitcoin and blockchains really awesome. Sorry. Okay, so we have governance challenges at Bitcoin, and it is introducing new features desired by users. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem because we're using the consensus rules that we have to change the consensus rules that we have to determine how the future of the consensus is going to work. So a good analogy to upgrading Bitcoin is upgrading an aircraft in flight, because this aircraft is, Bitcoin is carrying about $40 billion of people's money, and if you want to, tweak it, you got to be aware that there's a significant amount of people that are depending on, their survival, right? So in the case, the passenger, right? And this is particularly true. We're going to be doing a case study today on a particularly change, which is proposed called SegWit. All right, so before we go into the contentious changes to Bitcoin, to talk about these, let's talk about the changes to Bitcoin that are not contentious, that are happening every time you upgrade your client. Because if you're using Bitcoin, you'll see that there's regular software updates. So this is done by a team called Bitcoin Core. So Bitcoin Core is a team which maintains and builds one client of Bitcoin called Bitcoin Core, which is called the reference implementation, because traditionally people always use the consensus rules of Bitcoin Core as the real consensus rules. So if you want to, Bitcoin Core is Bitcoin, is the direct descendant of the Satoshi Nakamoto client, and it is the official Bitcoin that we know today. So it's a team of, I'd say, more than 100 developers with about a 10, 15 core group, which is really active, with 3 maintainers that are very independent individuals. So Vladimir van der Laan, which basically decides at the end of the day what gets merged or not, with Jonas Schnelli and Marco Falk, with a group of other developers, which are kind of the wise scientists, masters of Bitcoin. And what's really interesting, if you look at open source development, specifically this, there is this institution of Bitcoin Core, which is the result of spontaneous collaboration. This emerged out of nowhere. At the beginning, nobody was really sure how they were going to organize themselves, but it emerged basically from the ground up. There's a strong culture around the respect of procedures. It's very conservative. These are custodians of the code, so they're very conservative people. They're mostly volunteers. Some of them are paid by their bosses, by their companies, basically, to work on Bitcoin, but most of them are volunteers. There is also a sense of values and ethics associated to Bitcoin, which tends towards decentralization, privacy, and censorship resistance. So obviously, Bitcoin Core as a team is, proven consistent delivery. They are the top blockchain experts in the world by a mile. Cross blockchains, they are the best in the world, this team. And they're kind of the informal scientific community, which is studying Bitcoin and testing different upgrades and so forth. So it's really, there's 2 difference, right? There's 2 different pieces. There is the wallet of Bitcoin Core, which is just a wallet, and there's many other implementations in Bitcoin. There's Bitcoin Core, and then there's some built on top of that, like Bitcore. There's libBitcoin, which is completely separate, which is not Bitcoin Core, but whose consensus rules are mirrored on Bitcoin Cores, so it works. Bitcoin, BTCD, Bitcoin nodes. And what's contentious and what creates potentially a split versus just upgrades, for example, new upgrades appear in Bitcoin all the time, which make propagating blocks more efficient, and which create a lot of efficiencies all the time. So these are not consensus critical. They don't need to split. So what's consensus critical is basically changing essentially like what goes into the block, how the block is shaped, what kind of scripts we're putting in this block, kind of some core rules like the limit of coins. And any change, basically, it's not hard. It's not easy to describe exactly what defines consensus code. Not for me, but basically any change into like how the blockchain is built, not necessarily how your wallet behaves or broadcast blocks from one wallet to another. It's really like how the blockchain is crafted, like the recipe of the blockchain, basically. Okay, so assuming that, and this is a graph I did to kind of help everyone understand the changes in Bitcoin, how they work, and how I think they work, or how I think from at least a planning perspective. If I was gonna design Bitcoin, from what I have observed, this seems to be how it works. Okay, so the users usually start with requirements. This is not always true because the developers often know what the users will want in advance, and that's been pretty consistent. But normally, requirements for Bitcoin come from the users, right? So I want this, I want that, I want more privacy, I want more decentralization, I want lower fees. There's broad requirements that come from the users. And the users, they delegate the enforcement of this rules change. They want to change the rules, but they delegate this decision-making to the economic nodes, EN, that they're using, unless they are user nodes. So if you're a user and you run your own node, you're independent in this process. You're making your own choices. But if you're like most users and using a block explorer and using my Mycelium Red Wallet or anything like that, you're delegating that to either another node or server or a business, right? So the users, they communicate those requirements to the businesses that are trying to make money off of them. And that is the economic majority. Now, the economic majority will try to get a consensus around, okay, so are your users saying that? My users are saying that. Your users are saying that. So, okay, so we get a kind of a consensus that this is a requirement that's legit and that, has some, some potential to be implemented. And then the economic nodes are to consult the miners, and the exchanges should do roundtables and all of that to get a feel, for what the priorities of Bitcoin should be. And then they would tell that to the Bitcoin Core team. They will say, hey, Bitcoin Core, we want this, right? And Bitcoin Core will say, they'll first have this kind of, this is not how it happens, but conceptually, have this kind of checklist. So developers in Bitcoin Core, they're not going to propose a change that doesn't have a potential to have consensus. So they're going to look at the miners industry devs. They really like businesses to state their opinions, and they look at what users are saying, try to figure out if this is a good idea or not, if people want that. So essentially, once there's this idea that this is a good change, then the developers will create code and they'll say, okay, so this is, we were thought that you might want this, so this is code that will do this. And if you want to use that, then it's up to you to run it. So the developers can't force anybody to do anything. They're just proposing suggestions. What we see here also is the economic nodes. They enforce the rules of Bitcoin by validating blocks because exchanges are nodes. And so they provide, they'll basically say, like, if you're an exchange, they'll say, well, I'm not gonna accept this Bitcoin for, I'm not gonna buy this Bitcoin off of you. This is not the Bitcoin I want another Bitcoin. So because it has different rules, you're on a different blockchain. So the economic nodes, they do that. Essentially what we're looking at here is that at the center of the consensus forming process, that you have users themselves, or you have users that have delegated some responsibilities to the nodes that are kind of driving the consensus. So we'll see later, it doesn't start or end with the miners, not at all. But let's say that we have a broad agreement, I guess, on which changes we want. Now the problem is that it's a chicken and egg problem, because the miners, they'll produce blocks with the new rules that are going to be accepted by the majority, but the majority basically decides which blocks are valid or not. So who starts first to activate, right? So the idea is that we all activate at the same time, but there is a power struggle for who gets to activate the changes. So this is again just an essay. This is not exactly the official process. Okay, so let's talk about the current roadmap that we have in Bitcoin Core. So the broad requirements by the users, as I have observed them myself through my interactions with users: decentralization, open participation, so no KYC to go on the blockchain or Bitcoin or stuff like that. Security, stability, you want your Bitcoins to always be there. Privacy, censorship resistance, you don't want to be anybody who will be able to stop your transactions. Bitcoin and Bitcoin, people in Bitcoin want some smart contracts, which essentially means more advanced scripting language. Not Turing complete, but we can talk about stuff like a payment channel or Lightning Network is a form of smart contract. Sidechains are kind of, you can consider forms of smart contracts, or a multi-signature is a form of smart contract, by the way. Second layer solutions, and recently, as we've seen, the users want low transaction fees. Not all users, but most users tend to be biased towards paying less money to the miners, and more transaction throughput, so more transactions per second. So these are the requirements. Now, Bitcoin Core issued a roadmap about 2 years ago, which, as you can see, they already ticked off a lot of the boxes there. Let's go through that roadmap specifically. All right, so basically the roadmap has been signed by like 80 developers, 90 developers in Bitcoin Core. So it's not, a set of rules, it's just a kind of a priority list and general principles. So it's the official roadmap of Bitcoin Core, although obviously the specifics, there's no entity in Bitcoin Core. It's just a group of volunteers, so nobody decides. Step one is to optimize everything. So Bitcoin already works in a certain way, let's make it better. Let's make the block relay better. Let's make the signature libraries better. Let's make sure we use less data. Let's make sure that it takes 6 hours instead of a week to download Bitcoin like they've done recently. Then step 2 is SegWit. We'll get into that later. SegWit is an architectural change to the way that Bitcoin transactions are crafted, transmitted, and stored. It's a soft fork. It's a non-intrusive change, and it opens up for a lot of possibilities. So this was, for the last 2 years, the item that is being blocked, or has been blocked recently, but this was the stepping stone of the scaling roadmap. SegWit is absolutely crucial for it. Step 3 in the official Bitcoin Core roadmap is potentially hard forks. There's already a lot of proposals by Bitcoin Core developers to do hard forks. One of them is specifically interesting, called Pouliot by Dr. Johnson Lau, a Bitcoin Core developer. So it's not true that Bitcoin Core is against hard forks or anything like that. It is on the official timeline. But at the same time, we're looking at this hard fork research and how we can make it happen, and specifically making a wish list. Because if you're going to hard fork, you may want a hard fork with a lot of stuff in there that needs to be fixed. Anyway, some maintenance that needs to be done anyway, but that can only be done by a hard fork. Specifically, for example, the nonce area and the block header, that would be a hard fork, but it's kind of a trivial change that nobody would argue against. So this is the roadmap that was supposed to basically happen. So SegWit is on the roadmap, is number 2, and there's hard fork in number 3. So let's have a recap about what those things are. So in Bitcoin, in most blockchains, the way you introduce consensus level changes is either with a soft fork or a hard fork. This might be Bitcoin specific, or some altcoins based on Bitcoin do it like that as well. So very simply, it's actually not that hard to understand. Bitcoin soft fork is an upgrade mechanism, whereas a hard fork is a replacement mechanism. And we'll see that, for example, the soft fork, it adds rules or tightens them. So it doesn't, and you're basically making how the blockchain can be changed in a more restrictive, not exactly, you're basically making the rules more restrictive. Whereas in a hard fork, you're making the rules looser, or you're removing them. For example, the block size limit in Bitcoin is the way that is determines how the block is created. So it's a consensus level change. And if basically you move the block size from 1 megabyte to 500 kilobytes, that would be a soft fork. But if you put it from 1 to 2, it's a hard fork because the rules are more loose. The main difference is that the old software will accept the new blocks, so it's backwards compatible, whereas in this hard fork, it's the old software will reject the new blocks. So from the point of view of an upgraded node, so a node that's done its business in a soft fork, the new rules are good and the old rules are bad. If you haven't upgraded and you're in a soft fork, well, all the rules are good, also the new ones. And if you're a non-upgraded node in a hard fork, then the new rules are bad and only the old rules are good, so you're rejecting the new changes if you haven't upgraded. Really important vocabulary distinction. A fork is not a chain split. A chain split is not necessarily a fork. Why? Because, and then we'll try to split this vocabulary and say a fork will be a software upgrade. So it's something that's kind of deliberate, and a chain split is a result potentially of a software upgrade, or for example, of something else. For example, you can soft fork Bitcoin and not have a chain split. And you can have a chain split without an upgrade. For example, it happened in Bitcoin Core 0.8 in 2013. There was a temporarily accidental split, but it wasn't because of a new software. It was just a bug, right? Okay, so let's get to SegWit because this is what we're fighting over. SegWit is an architectural change to Bitcoin. It's a software which is backwards compatible. We're not going to go too much into details, but basically what it does is that a Bitcoin transaction contains inputs and the signatures of all those inputs. So if you receive, for example, let's say you receive 51 Bitcoin transactions and you're spending, 50 Bitcoin in one transactions. Basically, that transaction will have 50 signatures of all the inputs you received. The goal of SegWit is to change the way transactions are done by removing some of the unnecessary data and segregating it outside of the transaction using a new special status which is called a witness. And what's important is that not all the nodes have to keep this data. You can, if you want, to be sure to have more security, to have more control, more validation, but you don't necessarily have to. So this data has a discount in weight. Basically, the way that blocks are created without the parameter change size to block weight. And what this does is that you can put more transactions into a block. Essentially, transactions are then smaller, and you could put more of them into the block. So the analogy is kind of like if you're shipping, a container, you might as well try to make sure everything fits in the first container instead of messy container. It has a lot of benefits. Scalability is not the intention of SegWit. It is just a stepping stone and a side effect. The object of SegWit is to fix transaction malleability, which is a bug in Bitcoin that has been bugging us for a long time. It makes some of the changes of SegWit make it sure that we can implement changes in the future much easily. For example, Schnorr signatures, which will dramatically reduce the size of the signatures again and allow for some really cool scripts. Fixes quadratic hashing. It increases security for multi-sig, increases security for hardware wallets. Pretty much everybody benefits in some way or another. It has a lot of good benefits. SegWit was designed by the developers to be activated using a BIP. A BIP is a Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, BIP 141. And the mechanism for activating, Bitcoin is BIP 141, and the mechanism for activating BIP 141 is BIP 9. And at this point, I'm going to just turn over to Quentin and ask Quentin, is there anything you would like to add before we go into BIP 9 from the stuff that I've said before, corrections or comments or additions?
No.
That's good?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about BIP 9 a little bit and BIP 141 and where it comes
sure.
from?
So BIP 9 is basically a way to deploy simultaneously multiple software. So what it does is it's like miners have to follow some rules in order to deploy a soft fork. So to do that, they signal in the chain in the block header of each block to say, okay, so I'm going to activate this rule, and so you follow a few steps, and at the end you activate the soft fork. So I'm not going into detail of how BIP 9 works because like there are few steps, so few transition actually, which are very activate the soft fork. All blocks that are not respecting the new rules are off.
Right, exactly. So BIP 9 was an introduction to Bitcoin, which is a 2012-13, I think, maybe something like that. Let's see, 2015 actually. So it's a relatively new addition to Bitcoin, which was made by this guy, right? Who says, "I'm sorry, it's my fault." So I co-authored BIP 9, and he's sorry about that. Why? Because BIP 9 was basically a way for miners to irrefutably show their support. No, not their support. Sorry. Initially, it was the technical readiness. So you would signal for a soft fork if you were technically ready to do so, which gives the users the signal that, okay, the miners have now upgraded, they know this change, and we can feel free to, activate this, or, let's activate this because the miners are ready. So it can be, I guess, characterized as miner voting, although it was supposed to be voting for signaling readiness, which was the terminology. And the problem with that is that nobody thought that SegWit would not pass because there doesn't seem to be a lot of downsides to SegWit. The threshold was 95%. So basically BIP 141, which is SegWit, would activate once 95% of the miners would signal for that using BIP 9. And then we would also change, and the price of Bitcoins would double, and we would get an amazing new Bitcoin, which is much better than the previous one. And a lot of the altcoins would lose steam, and everybody thought that this would be great for everyone. But the problem is that the miners have not been signaling, and there's a deadline, right? So there was 1 year. The miners had a year for, and this is what Rusty, a Linux kernel developer who built this, said, is that we would just put 1 year because we thought if it's bad, then it's just going to go away, and if it's good, it's going to be accepted really fast. They did not think at all that the miners were going to be using that against the users. But I thought that the point of Bitcoin was that the miners vote with their hashes. So the miners should get to vote as a democracy on what changes. are put into Bitcoin. Well, this is a misunderstanding. It's actually a mistake. The miners vote on which transactions go in the ledger and in which order, but they do not necessarily vote, and nowhere in the white paper says that they vote on protocol upgrades. Actually, the first changes to Bitcoin, a lot of the changes to Bitcoin have been, user activated software, just saying, we're just going to change the software at this date, and everybody upgrade. So it is a fallacy to believe that because miners have the ability to signal their readiness for something because the developers so kindly built that for them, and because the miners do actually vote for which transactions go in the block, they do actually vote there. It is a misunderstanding to believe that they vote for what software gets activated, and I'll show you why. So this is a bit outdated. So this is this was a hard fork proposal called Bitcoin Unlimited, which you have here, which a lot of the miners are signaling for. At this point in time, it was about 40%. It's probably around the same right now. And you have the other core nodes at about 57%. But if you look at this here, what you see is that you have all these nodes, which are Bitcoin core nodes. And these are the Bitcoin Unlimited nodes. And we'll see what happens if the miners think that they can vote in new changes to Bitcoin. So this is what happens. So full nodes in Bitcoin have a lot of power. They validate the transactions. They validate the blocks that the miners feed them. For example, Roger Ver, which is a very prominent opponent to SegWit for reasons that are hard to understand, accidentally, with his mining pool, created a block which was not 1 megabyte because he was probably using Bitcoin Unlimited, which is buggy software. And he actually created a block that was more than 1 megabyte. And what happened is that his pool started to propagate it. And the Bitcoin Unlimited nodes, they received that. They also propagated it. But all the Bitcoin Core nodes said, not passing. Not only this block is not valid, we're banning the node that fed us an invalid block because, once I was trying to cheat the rules of Bitcoin. So the block was rejected. And as you can see, the block is kind of floating away, disintegrating. It was rejected by the network, along with the block reward and all the work that went into it. So the full nodes will not accept and relay blocks that are not valid. So unless you convince all the nodes to upgrade, then you can do whatever you want, but your blocks are just not going to get accepted by my node. So I don't know what that is. That's not Bitcoin. This obviously happens automatically for those who weren't conscious of that. This is just the client which is running, which is doing everything. So in a fork scenario, the businesses, for example, Bitcoin Unlimited was a very hostile hard fork with very bad intentions and bad code. So this actually is a bug in Bitcoin Unlimited assert 0, which caused all the nodes in the network to go down, or most of them for a bit of time. And this is what they were trying to sneak into our wallets. So we were really not happy with that change, and a lot of us weren't happy with that change. So when we're talking about governance, we got together as businesses and we said, you know what? You can feed us miners those nodes, but we are letting you know that we're going to be enforcing our rights according to the protocol. We have the ability to not validate those rules. We won't accept them, right? So we made it really, really clear that we wouldn't list that, we wouldn't accept that. And I don't think we had a meaningful impact because it was a lot of small Bitcoin businesses from people that I know. But this is the kind of stuff that economic nodes should be doing for protocol governance and scaling in Bitcoin. So who's opposed to SegWit and why is it contentious? That's a really good question. Let's get into some name dropping. So some large mining manufacturers like Bitmain is the main opponent to SegWit. Bitmain produces anywhere between 60, 70, 50% of all the hardware in the world for mining that we know of. We don't know that, but these are the claims. So as one of the monopoly manufacturers, actually, I think they're kind of a monopoly, a manufacturer, or very close to. They have a lot of leverage over the miners themselves and over the pools. So some of the large mining pools, some of them are Bitmain, are run directly by Bitmain or as a known proxy. Some of them are believed to be run by Bitmain, but most of them are getting their equipment from Bitmain. Some large holders and investors and prominent personalities are against SegWit. Roger Ver is against SegWit. Roger Ver believes that if we get SegWit, he will lose his leverage to get bigger blocks. which is what he wants. And this is also the argument of Bitmain. And there's a lot of communities that are supposedly, there's a very active communities online that are, we can call them, some of them are trolls, some of them are genuine, but there's a lot of activity online for against SegWit, although as we'll see, this is not reflected at all in the businesses which all support SegWit. So why are they opposed to SegWit? Well, SegWit is kind of Bit9 is their only leverage. It's the only leverage they have, right? They're not supposed to be using that leverage, right? It's supposed to be kind of a formality, but they're using it as a leverage for other changes, bigger blocks. Why do we want bigger blocks? I don't know. Maybe they want more transactions. Maybe they want to centralize Bitcoin a bit more. Who's to say? Another potential reason is ASIC boost. That's very controversial. ASIC boost is, not going to go deep in that, but let's just say that some miners are believed to have secret advantages that are rendered useless with the advent of SegWit. So kind of a way to cheat, not necessarily cheating. There's a debate to whether it's really cheating or not. But some miners might have a secret advantage, which kind of skews the game theory in that we weren't aware of before and we didn't plan for, that they would have a secret advantage that SegWit would stop. And that they have, for example, ASIC boost for, anyway, let's get that. And there's genuine opposition by some people who think, probably sure they're genuine. We're going to go a little bit faster. Right. So rule of economic nodes, basically choosing which Bitcoin is the valid Bitcoin and putting some value into that. So almost everybody wants to stay on one chain. People can fork off of Bitcoin at any time. They can do so with the balancers or without the balancers. You can fork the code or the history. But we're fighting for the name of Bitcoin and for the network effect of Bitcoin. The people that really don't want SegWit to pass, for example, bought Bitcoin.com, whereas Bitcoin.org is Bitcoin Core. So we can see that this is a battle for the network effect, which is what it's about in blockchains generally. So a consensus failure is a governance failure. It's not good. It's really bad. The Ether fork was really bad. A lot of people lost a lot of money. Recently in Canada, an exchange lost $12 million as a result of the fork because of problem with splitting up Bitcoin in Ethereum 1 year later. So that's something we really want to avoid. So there are fork proposals, some of which will lead to a split, some of which will not lead to a split. Okay, so this is the part where we get a little bit more into what's going to happen in the next few weeks. Now that we have all this context. So BIP 141, manual activated soft fork for SegWit at 95%. Everybody wants that to happen. Everybody wants that to happen except a very, 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 very small minority. The miners have about 60 blocks, 50, 40 blocks left at this time, I think. Maybe not even. Is it even too late at this time? Right. So this has been an opportunity for them to activate SegWit for a year. And they have about 30 blocks left to do that. And if they don't do that in the next 30 blocks, which is pretty clear it's not going to happen, then we won't get SegWit before August 1st, that's for sure. BIP 91, it's basically similar to BIP 141, but it requires less activation threshold. And as we'll see later, this whole thing is getting kind of ridiculous and complicated. All the schemes that these people are doing not to use BIP 141 are very strange and very heavy. But basically, BIP 91 is a way for SegWit 2x to be compatible with the existing signaling of BIP 141. If you don't know what that means, welcome to the club. BIP 148, the UASF, is the most important one, the one we're here today, because it will happen. It will happen on August 1st. There's no scenario in which the soft fork does not happen. That is a guarantee. Why? Because I will be using that client, so I will be forking off of, I will be doing a soft fork, so it will happen. I might be the only one, I'm not, but it will happen. At this point in time, so BIP 148, what it does, it's not, okay, we'll get to those later. SegWit 2x, so this is not part of Bitcoin Core, although it's based off of Bitcoin Core. This is Bitcoin Core. This is Bitcoin Core. This is kind of a patch after SegWit 2x, or at the same time was created. SegWit 2x is not Bitcoin Core. It's another client, and it's basically a bundle of a soft fork and a hard fork at the same time. It was rushed out as a response to the August 1st deadline arriving, and it was nobody really. There's a lot of speculation as to why, but it is a safe, face-saving move for a lot of people to kind of, accept that SegWit is happening in a way, but not accept that SegWit is happening by giving in to what they disagreed on and what they oppose. And Bitcoin ABC, we'll get to that a little bit later, which is the secret Bitcoin client prepared by Bitmain. It's not so secret. It's I think it's open. But in case the BIP 148 soft fork, sorry.
No, I'm saying like it's secret mining. It's like
Oh, yeah. So it's an open client, but they're going to use for secret mining. So if BIP 148 UASF is successful or is nearing success, we'll understand why in a minute. The Bitmain has decided to fork the chain. We'll understand why in just a moment. So this is the timeline. Thanks to Aaron Van Weerden. Right? Aaron, if you're watching, thank you very much for this. So we are July 13th. Today is the deadline for because we need to have a full difficulty adjustment period of BIP 141 before it's activated, and the next difficulty adjustment period is like in 30 blocks, and there won't be a second one, a full one, before August 1st. So that's, let's forget that, that's dead. Unfortunately, that was the easy way for everyone. So BTC1 is the SegWit 2x client, which is developed by Jeff Garzik. So this is kind of like a miner plus large business idea, which is rejected by the entirety of the Bitcoin Core team, and which is rejected by a lot of users vehemently, although a lot of the big businesses kind of got together in a kind of Bilderberg meeting and decided to do that, make that happen. But it's, it's a laudable effort, but so basically this client needs to start to be released tomorrow. And we don't have a lot of time because it needs to start tomorrow, and then on July 21st, after they've had 1 week supposedly to test, miners are supposed to implement BIP91. So start signaling basically for that 80% SegWit thing. And then potentially getting that locked in after 269 blocks. Yeah. And then getting that activated, potentially we get SegWit after another 336 blocks. Is that it?
That's like 360, $1.
So it's like 600 blocks, I think, or something like that, right? And then, okay, so this is if we get that before the 1st of August, then there's no chain split. On August 1st, and the deadline for obviously this is already passed. On August 1st, we activate BIP 148, and what's going to happen at that time? What's going to happen on August 1st is that some users are running a client which is called the user activated soft fork client, and essentially what it does is that when we run this client, we will be rejecting the blocks of miners that do not signal BIP 141. So miners are supposed to be signaling right now that they're ready for SegWit, and this is the queue that we've programmed into Bitcoin, that once 95% of the miners agree to SegWit, this was the rule, we all upgrade at the same time. Some of them are not signaling their readiness, even though we know they're ready. So all their blocks, we're going to consider them invalid. We are going to orphan them. So it's like, you go to a restaurant, they want to become, they want to add meat to the menu. I'm not gonna eat your thing if you put meat in it, Or I want something else, and if you don't feed me what I'm paying you for, because the users are paying the miners with fees and inflation, we just won't accept your block. We don't want it. It's an economic boycott. That's what it does. It just says that if you just signal SegWit on your block, I will accept it. So this is what starts happening on August 1st, is that everybody that has this client will start orphaning or rejecting the blocks by the miners. So BIP 148 was proposed by an anonymous Bitcoin and Litecoin developer called Charlie Fry. That's him over here. It allows users to require, so it's a tool that you can opt into, which requires miners to signal their readiness to implement segregated witness. And it doesn't mean that they have to run SegWit. It just means that they have to say that they're technically able to do so. Miners are allowed still to mine non-SegWit blocks and are only required to not mine non-standard blocks that span SegWit transactions. So basically, if you really don't want SegWit for any reason, just signal your readiness for it and don't use it. So the rationale is that the miners work for the users. We pay them with fees and inflation, as I just said, and they are essentially providing a service for us, and we want to be served better. We users, with our nodes, we validate the blocks and we check that the rules are valid. So Bitcoin for nodes and the users, we are responsible for enforcing the rules. BIP 148 is only an activation method. It's not like SegWit 2x. It's not like Bitcoin ABC is going to see. It's basically a way to activate BIP 141, which is SegWit. It's been tested by 2 years by the smartest people in the world. I kid you not, the team that work on SegWit is the greatest financial engineering effort probably of open source development ever, just SegWit. Maybe Bitcoin, obviously, when Satoshi did it by himself. Miners are maliciously, I believe, so disclaimer, this is starting to be my personal opinion now, I believe the miners are being malicious and acting Bit9 against the interests of the network, and to a degree which is previously unseen by an actor in Bitcoin. So the degree to which they are jeopardizing the progress of Bitcoin is really heavy. And it is a non-violent boycott system. You can't coerce anybody into doing anything. So it's a peaceful way for us to stop paying certain miners until they signal that they're ready to feed us the blocks that we asked for. So victory scenarios for BIP 148. So what would be a victory for us that are proposing or that are implementing and advocating for this change? Well, you know, if in the next few hours the miners activate BIP 141, that's a victory. There's no chain split. If miners lock in SegWit 2x disclined, so if they lock in basically the BIP 91, right? And signal for BIP 141 as a result, because basically what's funny is that the BIP 91 is the same thing as BIP 148 in a way, because miners, that's when you achieve this 80% signaling of BIP 91, you don't get SegWit. You start to orphan blocks that are not signaling BIP 141. So it's this whole thing is really complicated for nothing. This was really easy to do. If we do get SegWit before and everybody's signaling this anyway, then it doesn't matter. If you're running a USF node and if this works, then nothing happens. There's no chain split. If some miners go on the BIP 148 chain, after 100 blocks, because the miners cannot spend a block for 100 blocks. After 100 blocks, if a miner finds a BIP 148 block, the chain will split. A victory scenario would be that at an increasing rate, the miners will start to mine the USF chain until we reach over 51% consistently, up to 60% there, which would lead to either no split or a quick reorg. We'll get to that. A quick reorg of the legacy chain with some user loss of funds, not the BIP 148 users, the ones that didn't upgrade and were transacting as usual. But ideally, if it's fast, a few hours, and it's not a huge deal. A pyrrhic victory, so a victory for SegWit, but to the detriment, kind of like spiting your face, cutting your nose to spite your face kind of thing, is that the BIP 148 chain gets consistent 60% after a few days or a few weeks, not a few hours. And I'll tell you what reorg means. It'll make more sense. And in which case, the legacy chain is reorged into, the legacy chain is the people that are running Bitcoin Core and not the USF chain. So the people that just stayed on the old chain and didn't upgrade. After a few days, there will be a reorg. That means that, as we'll see, there's going to be severe loss of funds for a lot of users. So that's a very sad victory indeed. The failure scenarios, I'll actually go to the reorg right now. It's going to make more sense. A reorg is a chain. A reorganization is when a Bitcoin client, so the software that you're running, it discovers a new longest chain with valid rules. So the rule in Bitcoin is that your client will always follow the longest valid chain. But what happens if, poof, out of nowhere, your client discovers a new longest valid chain? Well, that's because the UASF chain, if it gets longer, because it's a soft fork, and the rules are stricter, it is valid. So if the BIP 148 chain gets longer than the legacy chain, then all of the clients can be like, well, I'm going to switch over to this chain. And all the transactions that happened on the legacy chain before. So, I'll get this very simple. This is the legacy chain. And then these miners start building on top of the legacy chain, but we on the BIP 148 chain, we start building some other blocks, and this one gets always longer, longer. But at this point, this one will get longer, and all of this transaction history will disappear. And this is a one-way deal. That means that the BIP 148 chain cannot disappear. Only the legacy chain can disappear. So this is a huge impact on obviously the game theory elements of this protocol upgrade. And this is what you need to fear the most. What you need to fear is you need to fear that you've transacted on this side and that it disappears after. This is the worst scenario that can happen to you. Yeah, so the blocks that contained your transactions that you saw confirmed on your client will disappear. Ergo, your transaction will also disappear. And yeah, you lost that money. So from a miner point of view, I'll go back a little bit. Yeah, I had one very close. So a failure scenario is that users, they don't actively adopt BIP 148, and neither do businesses and miners. And in that case, the blocks would not confirm. There would be no miners. There would be no economic activity, and it would just die. But in that case, most businesses like mine, we would just say, well, we tried, we failed, we'll try again, and we'll go back to the legacy chain. Where it gets, it's kind of an all or nothing scenario. Where it gets really interesting is that if the miners adopt BIP 148 with less than 13% hash rate, and right now the problem is we don't know because miners have no way to signal. They can signal BIP 148, but we don't know exactly. I think there's like 1% now that are signaling or something, but we might be surprised. But if we get 13% of BIP 148 miners, because BIP 148 only activates BIP 141, and BIP 141 has a deadline on November 15th, if we get lower than 13% hash rate just using math, we know that because the difficulty adjustment is going to come in such a long time that we're not going to be able to do it in time for November 15th. So this is the magic number in which this just expires and it's just nothing, it's no longer good. Oh, right, I meant to put here BIP 148, okay? BIP 148, it activates, oh no, sorry, BIP 141 activates on the BIP 148 chain before the deadline, which is amazing, which before November 15th, but with no market support. And, you know, for some, maybe it was 15% of the miners, but there's no market support. And the chain gets abandoned, and you still have the BIP 148 coins, but they're worth nothing. I mean, if you try to sell them, a collectioner might buy them for a few cents, but no one will buy those coins off of you. Another failure scenario is that, okay, so you can all see that the big problem is that if you're on the legacy fork, you're a chain of a reorg, and if you're on the USF side, you have a risk that your coin is going to go to zero because it's not going to have any value. So Bitmain said, well, there's a way we can change that, change the dynamics, is that if there's a BIP 148 soft fork and the legacy chain is at risk of a reorg, of having their transactions disappear, we can hard fork that legacy chain to make a third Bitcoin, the ABC Bitcoin, the Bitmain Bitcoin, which is not at a risk of a reorg because it was hard forked specifically for this reason. In that case, the legacy chain would obviously just either disappear, have a really low value. We don't know what happened, but you know, it would still be at risk of disappearing. The Bitmain, you know, Beijing miner fork and their buddies is very they're secretly mining on the, anyway. They plan to do a lot of bad stuff on there. But if I'm totally wrong and people like that, they can go to that chain and they will not be at a risk of a reorg. So if you want to do that, you can protect yourself that way if they go through with their plan. And also a failure scenario is if the miners, they consistently attack the BIP 148 chain by basically creating empty blocks, essentially just blocking everything from happening. In that case, you know, making transactions there just doesn't work. There's just no blocks on there. So, you know, your blockchain is just not happening. And in that case, you abandon BIP 148, or the nuclear option is that, I will say right now, I personally do not condone this, and I don't consider that to be a viable option, and I would not do that. But it is an option, is that if the Bitcoin ABC Bitmain group attacks the BIP 148 chain, the BIP 148 ecosystem can decide to resist and push a change of proof of work on that chain with a hard fork that would immediately render useless all of Bitmain's miners, and you could only mine Bitcoin with another hashing algorithm, which doesn't work for anyone's miners, but this is true for all of the miners. So all the miners would lose their millions of dollars of investment that they invested in to secure the blockchain, and it would irrevocably fork BIP 148 as not Bitcoin. Obviously, it would become an altcoin. It would become some kind of Litecoin or something, but that has a shared history with Bitcoin before the fork. So from the miner's point of view, if we're trying to be empathic here, and we're going over time, I'm sorry, everyone. From the miner's point of view, this could be considered an attack because it doesn't force anyone to do anything, but it does put you in front of an ultimatum. And people are boycotting your product for reasons. So I mean, it can be construed as an attack, although that's how Bitcoin works. Some miners may want to take the opportunity and profit because miners compete within each other. Miners are users. Miners are not this abstract. I'm a miner. Tone's a miner, or trying to be a miner. So we're all, a lot of those are miners, but some miners might want to, take the opportunity to upset the balance of power. They've always been on the losing end, and Bitmain's always been on the winning end. So they might want to, switch over to USF right away. What if a few big mining pools, called each other and said, let's do this. Let's make Bitmain lose some money and let's make some money at the same time. So miners can choose to permanently fork the legacy chain, and they can choose to attack the USFT. So they have a lot of options. Everybody has a lot of options. So chain split scenarios and strategies. Very big disclaimer. I am just someone which is researching this just like you guys. So this is not a recommendation. None of this is a recommendation, by the way. There is endorsement of this thing by myself, but I don't recommend necessarily, don't act based on my recommendation. Do your own research. But okay, so practical tips. First things first is get all the Bitcoins on a wallet you control, where only you have access to the private keys. This is more important than ever because if your Bitcoins are on Coinbase, Coinbase will decide for you what happens. Make sure you're able to detect the chain that you're on, that you have access to some tools that can tell you if you received a BIP 148 Bitcoin or a legacy Bitcoin. And it just so happens that I built one for you guys with the help of the magnificent Francis Brunel, which is somewhere in this room. It should raise your hand. No. Francis Brunel is a local developer. He built that for us. So if you go to uasf-explorer.satoshiport.com, this is a UASF Bitcoin block explorer. It will only detect transactions on this chain and not on the legacy chain. And you can use a regular block explorer for that. You can choose to connect to a specific node. Obviously, run your own node if you can, but you can choose to connect to a specific node that you trust will remain on the USF chain. So the best way to know, for example, I'm running two nodes, a legacy and a USF node. I'm running an Electrum server, which if you have Electrum, all you have to do is go into settings. You can connect to my server if you trust me. What you'll see is this thing. You'll see a PGP signed message from me saying I promise, pinky swear, to leave it on the UASF chain, although this is not standard practice. You don't want to trust me, but if you can't run your own server and you want to use Electrum, I mean, you can, if you want to trust me, this is a signed message from me. You can connect, you can use your regular wallets like Samurai Bread Wallet, Bitcoin for Android, and connect to an IP node. Just select an IP of a node that you know is running USF, yourself or a buddy of yours. So this is like if you have Airbits, you can select my Electrum server in Airbits, and then you will be on the USF chain, so electrum.satoshiport.com. If you look at, but just run your own node if you really want to be sure. So these are practical tips. So strategies, risk averse, hold your coins, do nothing. If you hold your coins and you do nothing, you do not transact while there is a chain split, you have no chance to lose at least one of the two chains. The winning side is Bitcoins. You will, once one side wins, you will have your balance intact on that side. So wait to see where the wind blows. Wait for the chain split to stop, for there to be a reorg, or for one to go to zero. But be aware that there will always be a reorg risk forever, unless there's a hard fork on the legacy chain. So really, if you hold your coins, you do not transact, you're good. So if you want to just wait this one out, there's a business in Canada called Coin Cards, and they said we haven't had a vacation in years. Taking a vacation in August 1st for a week. No problem with that. Moderate strategy, moderate risk. You can split your coins when the chain occurs, when the chain split occurs. And you can sell your legacy Bitcoins, the ones that you had before, for fiat, and keep that in. And this is always depending on the price of Bitcoin, right? This changes according to the price of Bitcoin. But you can sell your Bitcoins for fiat and keep them and keep them in fiat, right? So if you had 10 grand worth of Bitcoin, say the price doesn't drop, it will, but let's say it doesn't drop that much. You have 9 grand worth of Bitcoin or whatever. You get that 9 grand and you just keep it in fiat. But you keep the BIP 148 coins because you basically got them for free. You don't transact more, don't do anything. You wait to see what happens. And either you buy back the legacy chain if it wins with the fiat you have, or you double down. You basically double your Bitcoins. And you double down with the fiat you got, and you buy the BIP 148 Bitcoins that are now the official Bitcoin. However, be aware that if there is one side losing and one side winning, it will happen in a snowballing effect. So the price at which you can sell your legacy coin, basically, if there's a rework about to happen, the price of the legacy coin will gradually tend towards zero, as inevitably the transactions happen to disappear, as less and less people will want to buy it unless they don't know what's happening, or they just, you know.
If you want to do that, like for this technique, like if you want to be sure, like you have to keep your Bitcoin on a transaction place, like to exchange for sure, because probably they will disable deposit on August 1st.
So you can opt to give the exchange the choice to decide how they manage the split for you, but you need to make sure that the exchange has a policy which specifically says how they will split and like how it's gonna work. Because if they don't have a specific policy before, they're just gonna choose whatever is worse between, you know, reputational loss and just closing down if they lose your money. So you can do that. You can leave them on an exchange, but in that case, you are, you know, you have a less chance to screw up, but you're powerless as to the exchange's decision. So this is a way to hedge yourself essentially, and possibly to profit. So there's two very risky options. So you can try to sell your BIP 148 coins to some company like Bills. Bills will be accepting BIP 148 coins. It's one of the few big businesses that will do that. You can spend only your BIP 148 coins, convince it's never going to work, dump them to someone you think is an idiot, and you can buy some legacy coins with the BIP 148 coins that you just made, and then you can double your legacy coins, which are still at risk of a reorg. Or you can keep the fiat and hedge yourself, of course. If you're risky also, if you're going all in, you sell your legacy coin, you go all in on BIP 148, and you risk the value of every one of your assets to go to zero, but you have more chance to basically buy cheap BIP 148 coins that will become the real Bitcoin. This is the way you would make the most money if you were going to be very, very risky, but also, you know, you risk everything going to zero. I personally will be using probably the moderate strategy. This is not an endorsement. This is just a statement of fact. Okay, how to split the coins? There's not a lot of tools available. Actually, there's minimal amount of tools available. You can probably do it if with Bitcoin USF and Bitcoin Core running. Hopefully, Electrum, which is one of the best wallets in the space, the best light wallet in the space. They're supposed to, in the 2.9 release, which is called Independence for a reason, you will have the ability to specifically select on which chain you're transacting automatically. Because normally what you need to do is you need to commit one coin to one blockchain to avoid a replay type. Because if you spend, for example, on the legacy chain, that transaction will be replayed on any chain where that transaction is, you know, relayed. So you want to stop this replay protection. I know this is a bit complicated, but basically, if you spend Bitcoins, you can basically send on both chains at the same time. And, you know, you don't want to do that because you want to, you know, at least get a chance to, you know, to choose which one you're sending. So basically, if you send a transaction on the BIP 148 chain, it will only be seen on the BIP 148 chain. You can send it to yourself, right? And in that case, because the legacy chain will not have seen it, it won't be that blockchain. So your Bitcoins, your BIP 148 Bitcoins, could be consecrated once they're confirmed on that chain, but this requires a confirmation. So this is very hard, and the software's not out, and I haven't checked it out yet. So you can email me if you want to do this. I will be doing one group session where we will be splitting coins, but I can't do that. I can't explain that here. I'm very sorry. What's the likelihood it's going to happen? It's extremely hard to gauge. A lot of people are very loudly supporting, like myself. A lot of people are quiet, so we don't know. It's kind of a poker game, and we're the last river card, and we've been bluffing for a long time, and now it's just reveal. There's nothing else than reveal. For sure, a lot of transactions will happen on Electrum on the BIP148 chain. That will happen because if you're using Electrum and you're not careful, you might be randomly connecting to my node and transacting on the BIP148 chain if you don't want to. Trezor offers the option. Samurai Wallet offers the option by default, I think. So if you use Samurai Wallet, make sure you are aware you're using the BIP148 chain by default. Sorry, Samurai, if this is incorrect. People should check that. And there's almost 1,000 nodes that are running Bitcoin UASF. This is the list of developers that are supporting BIP148, which didn't pass. BIP141, this is BIP148. So these are Bitcoin Core developers. So second best in terms of consensus. This is the amount of developers which are accepting the Segwit 2x proposal. No. And these are some of the businesses that are accepting or not one of these proposals. So there's not a lot of businesses that are signed up for this. There's a lot of developers that are signed up for this. So this is the amount of nodes singling UASF. So as you can see now, it's about 1,000. At Bills, so this meetup is sponsored by my startup Bills. So Bills, we will be accepting BIP148 coins only after the chain split. We will not be accepting your coins that are vulnerable to reorg. I don't want them. I may offer to buy them at a discounted price, for example, 10% of the price of Bitcoin at the time. And I reserve the right to stop accepting BIP148 coins at any time, which is what any exchange should do to abandon a losing chain if it's what it's at the moment. Don't send us legacy Bitcoins. I still haven't decided if I'm going to be buying them off at a fixed like 10% of the Bitcoin price rate or just keep them or refund them. But don't send me legacy Bitcoins, please. I don't want to deal with that. And if the USF chain does not work, we will abandon it. Hopefully, we'll be the last ones to abandon it since we staked a lot in promoting this. And we'll try again with BIP149, which is yet another proposal in the future. So on this, it's been almost an hour and a half. I'm really sorry we went over time. I hope this was educational or informational. We will take some questions, but questions only about this presentation, please. So about scaling and Bitcoin USF and so forth. So after, I'll hand you the mic. Thank you. Sorry?
So thank you guys for your attention. So we're gonna have maybe a 10-minute Q&A because it was a little bit longer. Just for it, we have about 350 or 400 people online.
Oh, nice.
So we might take, actually, if you guys want to get involved, maybe to ask a question, and maybe Quentin or someone can. Okay.
Yeah. Let's just keep it. Yeah.
Okay, so
two questions, 2-3 questions.
2-3 questions.
This is the time.
A quick question.
Yeah.
Is for wallets such as Mycelium, is that option available to choose which IP we want to connect?
I don't think so. I think I should check that. Usually it's in the settings. You can use Airbits. You can use Samurai Wallet to choose your node. Green address, you can choose your node. Bread Wallet now just made it available. A few of those ones. And it's really just switch your balance from Mycelium to another one if you want to select. It's not a problem. Jamie.
Yeah, I can just check. So if you want to be the most conservative possible, stick your shit on Electrum and then don't touch it until November 15th.
Well, not even Electrum. Just hold your private keys and don't transact until the chain split has been resolved or until you're sufficiently confident that one chain has no chance ever, the BIP148 chain has no chance whatsoever of getting reorged. I don't want to give specific times, but after a week or two, like all of this should have blown over. And if it hasn't, then we're in from something really nasty, whether a hard fork, whether a really nasty reorg or something like that. So, yeah. There's no date. You just wait for the split to be over, or I'll probably be announcing, what I'm doing at some point.
It'll be obvious.
It will be obvious at some point, yeah.
So Bitcoin.org also, they got their network status.
Oh, great, perfect. Thank you very much. So check bitcoin.org for the network status to be aware of what's going on. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that may sound a weird question, but as a user, how do I support ASF?
So That's a great question. If you want to support UASF, I suggest you, if you're able to, running an Electrum server, that's great.
You can run a node.
Yeah, you can run a node. You can run a full node. Run a full node, that's the minimum. Run a full node that you're using, because if you're not using that full node and it's just standing there reeling, that's still good. It's still good, but you're not getting the full benefits. You can write to your exchange and ask them what their policy is. If you support it, tell them to list at least both so people can speculate and miners can make a good decision on which chain to follow, right? Because we need to have the two prices competing for miners to be able to make their decision. That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
On Twitter, on social media, promote it and say that, just tell people that you're going to do it, because we don't know who's doing it until that day where we reveal. So if we put ourselves out there, we give confidence to other people. I don't know if someone's ever seen that video where there's a guy dancing alone for like a minute, and then people start to dance around him and dance around him. Well, this is what's happening, right? So you need to go out there and start dancing and show people that, you know, you're with the flow, and other people will join.
Yeah, just like you have to install an enforcing BIP 148 full node, because so you can go to usf.co or bitcoinusf.org to get that.
Or bitcoinusf.org is
That's the OpenShift. Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
So still good. Still good.
Okay, last question, guys.
Yes.
So, what's the possibility and percentage do you think the chain gonna be split in August 1st?
Excellent question. We still don't know what's going to happen, because a lot of this depends on whether or not the SegWit 2x camp delivers the code in time and works, and it's tested for a week, and then 80% of people run that, the miners run that, they activate the BIP 141, no, they activate BIP 91, sorry. And if that happens, there's no chain split. That's the wild card.
You will know it by July 29.
Yeah. So we'll know 2 days in advance if there's going to be a split or not, for sure.
If it's not locked in, like if BIP 91 is not locked in by July 29, there will be a chain split.
All right. So if BIP 91 is not locked in by July 29th, there will be a chain split.
No,
Activated. Okay, so BIP 91 is not activated by July 29th.
No. Yeah. Activated. No, locked in.
It has to be locked in. It has to be locked in, right? Because they need to be already signaling for BIP 141.
Yeah.
Okay, correct. There will be a chain split. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So it needs to be locked in. So that takes 2 weeks to lock in. And there's July 13th. But there will be a soft fork for sure. Chain split, we still don't know.
And Tone, you have a question?
No, not a question. Just hi, my name is Tone Vase. This was streamed live on my YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch this presentation, I don't know if you can pull up the YouTube channel to show people, but otherwise, you can grab my card.
I'll put it on the blockchain.
We're putting on the meetup link.
We'll put it on the meetup link. Tone Vase, Tone, last name Vays. If you just Google me, you'll find my YouTube channel, and this video will be up there. And thank you all for coming out. I drove up here from New York for this, so it was great. I'm glad I'm here.
So Tone did the setup for me for the video for the live stream. So thank you very much, Tone, for doing that for us at the last minute. It's much appreciated. Thank you, everyone.